Okay, well, good morning, everybody. I'm James Turner. I'm Director of Programmes at the Sutton Trust, and I'm delighted to be welcoming our next speaker this morning, who, as you can see, is Sir Michael Barber, the Chief Education Advisor at Pearson. And that follows on from a very distinguished career in education, both here in the UK and internationally. So Michael is very well placed to give us some insights into this area. I think in terms of format, I think Michael's kindly agreed to speak for 15 minutes or so, and that should leave us 15 minutes at the end before the coffee break for some questions. So I'll hand over to you now, Michael, if I may, and welcome you to the podium.
Well, thank you very much, James, and thank you to my colleagues at Pearson and especially to colleagues in the Sutton Trust for organising this, because I think it is a really important theme. I just want to say a few words of introduction before I get into my main comments. First of all, it's really hard following Alison Wolfe on this subject, because she's a true expert, and I don't even claim to be an expert in this particular aspect of education. Secondly, I think probably nobody in the world, Britain is more associated with the targets that she just critiqued than I am, and I'm still in favour of them, and we can debate that. Although I wasn't responsible for the targets in this area, I hasten to add. I thought Alison gave, as Rod pointed out, a very optimistic presentation, and then when Rod asked her a question, she said, the reason I'm not optimistic is I was optimistic in the 1990s, and that didn't work out. And it reminded me of a Russian Prime Minister, Viktor Chernomyrdin, who's one of my favourite Russian politicians. Not there are many that I like, but he was good. He had lots of funny sayings. Like one of them was, he said, we keep trying to invent new institutions, and they all turn out to be the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which I thought was fantastic. But what he said that Alison reminded me of was, he was talking about his 2 years as Prime Minister. He said, we tried to do better, but everything turned out as usual. And that's what's not got to happen in the next 10 years in this field. And then just one other word of introduction. I haven't put it up there, but my Twitter handle is at @MichaelBarber9 if you want to join in. I mean, I know there's lots of tweeting going on, but I'd love to be part of that. I think Alison gave a very, very good account of where we are. And the message, which I'll come back to at the end, which I want to completely reinforce, is that I think partly as a result of her report, we are on a path that is potentially very powerful and transformative. And I hope that politicians across parties will get behind those. They might tweak them, refine them, develop them, strengthen them over time. And I'll come to some points about that in a moment. But the direction of travel is now broadly a strong one. And the fact that both Ed Miliband and Matthew Hancock were finding ways of agreeing with each other yesterday, and that Graham Stewart, the chair of the Education Select Committee over dinner last night, talked about this being the moment where there was a real opportunity, does suggest to me that we should have higher ambitions, not just of apprenticeships, but of the potential leadership for transformation of the apprenticeship programme in Britain over a 5 to 10 year period. Because if you listen to Alison, it's very clear that this, first of all, we have to get away from the endless kind of muddling through and changing and tinkering, but also that it needs not just structural change, it needs cultural change. We need to change the expectations that we have of the education system and the way it works. I just want to pick out two examples of where of this issue about the standards we expect and the culture that surrounds them. I mentioned this over dinner last night. I had the opportunity recently to travel on the Shinkansen, the bullet train from Tokyo to Kyoto. It's a very beautiful train. It's a very fast train. It's very smooth. It doesn't clunk. It just goes. And it leaves on time, and it arrives on time. And before you get on the train, 4 women dressed in a pink outfit go on, clean the entire carriage to make it spotless, and then turn all the seats around so that everybody faces forward whichever way the train happens to be going. And it is a very beautiful travel experience, and all the small details that make the difference work. And I compare that, Connor and I often travel on the first Great Western service to the West Country, which is kind of amateur by comparison. And as I was saying last night over dinner, you come towards Reading and then it says, unfortunately, we're delayed because there's congestion at Reading. And I'm sitting there thinking, didn't they know we were coming? How can you have congestion on a railway at Reading? Anyway, so all of these things, and the point I'm making is the standards set by the Japanese railways are quite different from the standards set by the British railways, but the standards are partly established by the provider, they're partly also established by the passengers or the users or the consumers or the society that surrounds them, and we just have to have higher ambitions of what we expect from an apprenticeship, from vocational education in general, and from the outcomes of that. The second thing is just to prove that Britain can do this, is to take, given it's been in the news recently, is to take British cycling. You know, we used to think that you kind of turned up with a bicycle, joined a race, rode along, and with a bit of luck you would win, but mostly you didn't because the French and the Italians and the Spanish were all better at it. But now it turns out we know how to do that. And the thing is, we professionalised it. That wonderful man, Dave Brailsford, totally professionalised that whole process. So if you're Bradley Wiggins and you're going to a cycle race, I'm not sure how this works out in his family, but his wife puts his bags in the back of the car in case he strains his back. They've thought about that. When he arrives at a hotel, there's a specific Bradley Wiggins mattress and pillow, and the hotel have to put that on the right bed for Bradley Wiggins to sleep on because that'll affect his performance. It's called the theory of marginal gains. The French even accuse the British of having rounder wheels at the Olympics because we've thought about that. So we can do this, but it is about that attention to detail. It's about the attention to the detail of the experience at the employer, the attention to detail of the person in the FE college, if that's where it is, or in the UTC or wherever this experience is taking place. So I just want to come on to a second kind of theme, which is the raising the participation age, which I debated many times with Alison. I think is a great symbolic moment. Passing a piece of law doesn't change the culture in the way that I've been describing, but it does give you a symbolic moment to say this is a time to be different and seize the opportunity. And we've been talking about raising the participation age to 18 since 1907. Churchill wrote a note to the then Prime Minister Campbell Bannerman between Christmas and New Year in 1907, saying, I think it's time we raise the school leaving age to 17. And then in the 1918 legislation, H.L. Fisher, the great historian and Liberal politician, passed the law towards the end of the First World War, and it said every young person between the ages of 14 and 18 should be in at least part-time education for those 4 years, but it was never implemented because of the 1921 spending cuts. And then in 1944, at the end of another war, we passed another wonderful piece of legislation, and this is the 70th anniversary. This very month is the 70th anniversary of that achieving its third reading. It got royal assent in early August. And again, we repassed that clause in 1944, and again we didn't implement it because again there were spending cuts in the period after it. We had to repay all the loans to the Americans in 1947-48. And then finally, another promise for the 1944 Act was that school leaving age would be raised to 16, quote, as soon as is practicable. That turned out to be 1972, so that was a 20-year delay. And then in 2004, I was in a cabinet committee at which Gordon Brown said, couldn't we do something really significant on the FE sector? If anybody has any ideas, could they send me a note? So I wrote Gordon a note saying time to implement the 19 Education Act. And maybe that could be a slogan for the forthcoming 2005 election. We're finally going to implement the 1918 education legislation. Anyway, as partly prompted by that and partly mainly because Alan Johnson took it up in his relatively brief but important period as Secretary of State for Education, the 2008 legislation that Ed Balls finally went through, and 2013 and 2015 are the years when it's meant to be required up to 17 and required up to 18. And as Alison says, since the labour market has collapsed for 16 to 18-year-olds, it's kind of a good time because there's no point trying to get employment if their jobs are going. But we might as well seize the moment of saying we want you in full-time or part-time education through to 18. The participation age is important. We might as well create the opportunities that are essential, and apprenticeships are at the part of that. And if we're going to seize that opportunity, building on Alison's comments, I think the way I'd put it is we need to professionalise our approach to the whole thing. I was talking with Ursula Reynolds, who's somewhere in the room, I think, yesterday over dinner, and she said the big thing that she said, I sat through, forgive me if you mind being quoted, hopefully not, I sat through yesterday and I realised that in Britain or England, as we've been talking about, you think about courses. In Switzerland, we think about jobs, and then we put the education in behind them. And I think So professionalising our national approach to apprenticeships would need building on over a sustained period, because this is culture change, remember, 5-10 years, thinking about what it would mean to think about the job with the education and the training and the apprenticeship behind it rather than the course. It would mean thinking about transforming employer engagement in a really radical way, with real pressure from other employers but also from government to get in behind this. And the excuse that you're a small business in the service sector, if you listen to Alison's comments, that's no longer acceptable. There may be some parts, as she said, where you wouldn't want apprenticeships, but actually every employer needs to be part of this, because if you don't hang together, as it were, you hang separately on this. And that's a second part, the professionalisation. You need fantastic facilities. I visited the apprenticeship programme at Rolls-Royce. It is spectacular. The facilities, the training, the quality, the broad education, the specificity of it, but also the generalisability of it is fantastic. We know how to do this. It's specific and generic. At the employer, you need somebody who's part of the business, but also knows how to be a tutor or a teacher or an encourager or a facilitator, and maybe get some training and recognition for that. And in the college, similarly, you need high quality teaching and learning, if that's where the other half of or the other part of the experience is. This needs to be valued and encouraged by schools. We hear far too many stories, don't we, where the teachers in schools simply don't know how to offer advice on how to get into apprenticeship because they've never thought of it. It's culturally kind of seen as a backwater, and to be fair to the teachers, they haven't been briefed on the potential opportunities sufficiently. There's not enough information around there. There's the whole thing about information, advice and guidance, and Alison is right that, of course, young people especially are more wired than they were forever, but they also need somebody who's going to challenge their degree of ambition, encourage them to go further, to think more broadly, to be more creative, because the risk is that you're wired and you just look for the jobs you know about rather than being open-minded. Somebody needs to challenge that, be the person that puts different and original ideas in your head, and that's partly from meeting your peers, partly from the family and partly from the school. But unless one or other of those opens your mind, there's a real risk that you just go on a path that you happen to know about rather than one that might have been better or more fulfilling or more creative. I think the UTCs in this country are beginning to do some really good work in this area, but the school system as a whole is well behind on that. I think the programmes have to be long enough to be really worthwhile and to get deeply into. In the 1980s, when, as Alison was saying, the government was basically systematically destroying the apprenticeship scheme we had before, I had a builder working in my house in Hackney, and he was in his late 70s at this point, and he was there for a few days, and a couple of times I talked to him about what it was like to be an apprentice when he was a boy, which is obviously going way back into the early part of the 20th century. And one of the comments that he said stuck with me. He said, after I'd been there 7 years, they let me hold the paintbrush. I'm not recommending that length of time, but the idea that this was a serious programme that you watched and you learned and all of that, I think we need to cling on to. And then there's assessment of all of that. And obviously Pearson is involved in this, and Rod, who's here, and my colleagues are much more expert than I am. But I just want to say one thing that we're thinking about that. First of all, I think if you're assessing an apprenticeship, you have to have a practice element as well as a written or theory element. It can't all be you can't all do it on paper, because you're testing skills, and the best way to test skills is to see them in practice. But secondly, what we've tried to do in Pearson is, rather than simply waiting for whatever statement comes out of Ofqual or the Department for Education, is to take the rhetoric, which we take seriously, which is we want world-class assessments. We hear that from the Secretary of State often, and I think he's absolutely right about that. But we've decided to take that phrase and say, well, what would work? How would we know world-class when we see it? We've defined it. So we've got a definition of what world-class looks like, and we've got a panel of world-class experts. Ursula Reynolds is one of the panel. She's particularly expert, but not the only expert on the group, with a vocational background. But we have the head of the National Institute of Education in Singapore, Sing Kong Lee. We have Peter Hill, who ran the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority, and before that the Hong Kong Qualification and Assessment Authority. We have Bob Schwartz from Harvard University, who's a real expert on vocational education around the world and international comparisons in that area. And then we have a handful of people who are in universities, colleges and schools in this country. And that panel now has to approve our qualifications. So there won't be a Pearson qualification that doesn't meet the world-class criteria. And then when government makes a statement, we see what they're saying and we say, well, a world-class qualification looks like this, so we want to debate with you some parts of what you're saying we should do. Obviously, in the end, it's up to government to set the criteria, but at least they'll know where they're requiring something that makes us diverge from what world-class would have been. And that is creating a very strong, valuable, productive, constructive dialogue with government, whereas before we were simply responding to the announcements that came out more regularly than anybody would have liked, actually. And that's a big step forward. So we're getting into what world-class looks like, and through the panel we'll know whether what we're doing is really pushing us in the world-class direction and keeping us out there. So my final point is this. I think there is a real opportunity to build on the progress of recent years, to take broadly the messages that Alison went through in the half hour before I was speaking, to try to get some kind of cross-party agreement on the way forward, because if we're going to get culture change, we do need the stability that Alison talked about. We do need to pursue it over a 5 to 10 year period through successive elections. And everybody in all the parties knows that our society and politics, a political system in the broadest sense, but also our economy depends on getting this part of the education system right. And it's an area, after all, you can go back into the 19th century, Alison again would be more expert than I on, to look at the number of reports we've had in British history that complain that we're falling behind the Germans. I think the first one was in 1870-something, and no doubt you could write another one now. I remember reading 20 or 30 years ago Corelli Barnett's brilliant book, The Audit of War, looking at the failure in science, technology, engineering, maths, and this whole area to really get serious about vocational education. We've got a new opportunity again for a variety of reasons. And I think the raising the participation age is a kind of symbolic moment when we can do that. So let me conclude by... And by the way, it's not just the politicians, it's the big stakeholders, employers, the education system, and others. Could we not get a 10-year agenda that would really build on this? And remember, the purpose of Sutton Trust getting into this is not just about improving the quality of apprenticeships, it's about social mobility. Skills are a way of making progress in society for individuals, and that would make the whole society much more healthy, and it would prevent the only route to social mobility being the route through university. So thank you very much for your time and for paying attention. Let's go away and implement the 1918 Education Act.